I'm Diana, 27 female. I live in a small, cozy apartment in the city, a world away from the sprawling estate I grew up on. By day, I'm an archivist for the city's historical society, surrounded by the quiet whispers of the past. It's a peaceful life, a life I chose, but one that has always been overshadowed by the family I tried to leave behind. My story is about the day that shadow tried to swallow me whole, and how the one secret I kept for myself turned out to be the light that saved me. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Growing up a Sinclair was less about being part of a family and more about being an accessory to a brand. My father, James Sinclair, was a titan of investment banking, a man who measured worth in stock prices and social connections. My mother, Jessica, was the perfect complement, beautiful, impeccably dressed, and dedicated to maintaining the flawless facade of our family's life. Then there was my sister, Florence. 2 years my junior, she was the golden child, the one who effortlessly embodied the Sinclair brand. She was a rising star in the social media world, her every post a carefully curated glimpse into a life of luxury, a life I had long since rejected. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the bookish one, the one who never quite fit into their world of glittering galas and hollow pleasantries. My passion for history, for the tangible remnants of lives lived long ago, was a baffling disappointment to my father. He saw no value in it, no potential for profit or prestige. It was, in his eyes, a hobby, not a career, and certainly not one befitting a Sinclair. My relationship with my family had been strained for years, a slow and steady erosion of affection that had left a chasm of polite indifference. I moved out at 18, eager to escape the suffocating pressure of their expectations. I put myself through college and graduate school, building a life on my own terms, a life that was mine and mine alone. We saw each other on holidays and the occasional mandatory family dinner, events that felt more like corporate board meetings than family gatherings. The conversation was always superficial, a carefully choreographed dance around any topic of actual substance. They would ask about my little job at the Historical Society with thinly veiled condescension, and I would offer vague, non-committal answers, knowing they weren't really interested in the details. They didn't understand my world, and I had long ago stopped trying to make them. The wedding invitation had arrived like a royal summons, thick cardstock embossed with gold filigree. Florence was marrying a man from a similarly wealthy and influential family, a union that was less about love and more about merging two dynasties. It was the social event of the season, and my attendance was non-negotiable. My mother had called me the day after the invitation arrived, her voice a mixture of excitement and thinly veiled command. "You will be there, Diana," she had said, "and you will look the part. We have a reputation to uphold." I knew what that meant. It meant a designer dress I couldn't afford, a smile plastered on my face, and a performance of happy families for the benefit of their 500 guests. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the pressure mounted. Florence, in the throes of wedding planning, became even more demanding and self-centered than usual. She would call me at all hours, not to talk, but to issue decrees. She needed me to pick up a specific type of ribbon from a specialty store across town, to chase down an obscure vintage of champagne, to handle the tasks her paid wedding planner deemed too menial. I was the family errand girl, the dutiful daughter playing her part. I did it all with a sigh of resignation, knowing that it was easier to comply than to endure the drama that would inevitably follow if I refused. Each task was a small cut, a reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. I was the supporting character in the grand production of their lives, always in the background, never in the spotlight. The week of the wedding was the worst. The Sinclair estate was a flurry of activity, florists and caterers and musicians swarming the grounds like ants. I was expected to be there every day, to help with the final preparations, to be at my sister's beck and call. I took time off from my job, a sacrifice that went unnoticed and unappreciated. I spent hours tying tiny silk bows to wedding favors, arranging place cards in alphabetical order, and steaming wrinkles out of tablecloths. Florence would sweep into the room, cast a critical eye over my work, and then issue a new set of instructions before flitting off to a dress fitting or a spa appointment. My father would occasionally appear, his presence casting a pall of the room. He would survey the scene with a look of detached approval, his gaze sweeping over me as if I were just another part of the hired help. He never spoke to me directly, instead addressing my mother or Florence, his voice a low rumble of authority. The day before the wedding, I found my mother in the garden, overseeing the placement of hundreds of white roses. She looked stressed, her perfectly manicured hands clenched at her sides. I approached her hesitantly, hoping for a moment of connection, a brief respite from the relentless pressure. "Everything looks beautiful, Mom," I said, my voice soft. She didn't turn to look at me, her eyes fixed on a florist who was struggling with a large arrangement. "It has to be perfect," she said, her voice tight. "Everything has to be perfect." I tried again. "Are you okay? You seem stressed." She finally turned to me, her eyes cold and distant. "I'm fine, Diana. I just wish you would make more of an effort. That dress you're planning on wearing tomorrow, it's a little drab, don't you think? You could have at least tried to find something more festive." I looked down at my simple, elegant navy blue dress, a dress I had spent weeks searching for, a dress that I had thought was both beautiful and appropriate. Her words were a slap in the face, a reminder that no matter what I did, it would never be good enough. I was the drab one, the disappointment, the daughter who didn't fit. I walked away without another word, the familiar ache of loneliness settling in my chest. I was an outsider in my own family, a ghost in the halls of my childhood home, and I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect blue sky stretching over the manicured lawns of the Sinclair estate. It was the kind of day that wedding planners dream of, a day that promised flawless photographs and happy memories. But for me, a knot of dread had been tightening in my stomach since the moment I woke up. I put on my drab, navy dress, styled my hair, and applied my makeup with a steady hand, creating a mask of calm composure that I did not feel. I was an actress preparing for a difficult role, the role of the devoted sister and daughter. The ceremony was a blur of white lace, fragrant flowers, and swelling orchestral music. Florence was a vision in her custom-made gown, a radiant smile fixed on her face as she glided down the aisle on my father's arm. I stood with the other bridesmaids, a silent sentinel in a sea of pastel pink. I watched my sister exchange vows with a man she barely knew, a man whose primary qualification was his last name. I saw the look of triumph on my father's face, the look of a man who had just closed the deal of a lifetime. I saw my mother dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her tears more for the performance than for the sentiment. It was all a beautiful, hollow spectacle, and I felt a million miles away from it all. The reception was held in a massive marquee on the back lawn, a tent transformed into a fairy-tale ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, tables groaned under the weight of extravagant floral centerpieces, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Hundreds of guests, a who's who of the city's elite, mingled and laughed, their voices a low hum of polite conversation. I found a quiet corner, nursing a glass of champagne, trying to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. I exchanged pleasantries with a few distant relatives, endured the condescending questions about my job, and smiled until my face ached. The centerpiece of the garden was a large, ornate fountain, a tiered monstrosity of marble and cherubs that my father had imported from Italy. It was his pride and joy, a symbol of his wealth and status. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, the speeches began. My father was the first to take the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. He spoke of Florence with a pride that bordered on worship, recounting her achievements, her beauty, her perfect match with her new husband. He didn't mention me once. It was as if he had only one daughter. I was used to it, but it still stung, a fresh prick on an old wound. After the speeches, the dancing began. Florence and her new husband took to the floor for their first dance, a carefully choreographed waltz that they had been practicing for months. The guests gathered around, their phones held aloft, capturing the perfect moment for social media. I stayed on the periphery, watching from a distance, when I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was my father. "Diana," he said, his voice cold and hard, "come with me." He led me away from the marquee, his fingers digging into my arm, pulling me toward the fountain. A small group of his friends, all of them loud and boisterous from too much champagne, followed us. "Gentlemen," my father announced, his voice slurring slightly, "I want to show you S. Omathing." He gestured toward me, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "This is my other daughter, Diana, the artistic one." His friends chuckled, their eyes raking over me with a mixture of pity and amusement. "She's a little different," my father continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "She thinks that money and status are unimportant. She lives in a tiny apartment, works in a dusty old building, and reads books all day." He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes glittering with malice. "She thinks she's better than us." I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the blood draining from my face, the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. I looked at my father, at the man who was supposed to love and protect me, and I saw a stranger, a cruel, petty man who was using me for sport. "Dad, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't do this." He ignored me. "So," he said, turning to his friends, "I thought it was time for a little Sinclair-style intervention. A little reminder of what happens when you get too big for your britches." And then, with a sudden, violent shove, he pushed me into the fountain. The shock of the cold water took my breath away. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the slick marble, and fell into the basin with a splash. The water was waist-deep, and my dress, my beautiful navy dress, was instantly soaked, clinging to me like a second skin. I looked up, gasping, my hair plastered to my face, and saw them all laughing. My father, his friends, and now other guests who had been drawn by the commotion. They were pointing and laughing, their faces twisted in amusement. They were laughing at me, at my humiliation, at my pain. And then I saw my sister, Florence, standing at the edge of the crowd, a small, smug smile on her face. She raised her phone, and I saw the flash of the camera, the perfect moment, the perfect post, the ultimate humiliation. I don't know how long I sat there, in the cold water of my father's fountain, surrounded by the laughter of strangers. It felt like an eternity. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the party fading into a dull roar. All I could see were their laughing faces, all I could feel was the icy grip of shame. I wanted to disappear, to melt away into the water and never be seen again. I had never felt so alone, so utterly and completely alone. The forgotten daughter had finally been remembered, but only as the punchline to a cruel joke. And in that moment, something inside me broke. The part of me that had always craved their approval, the part of me that had always hoped that one day they would see me, that they would love me, that part of me died in the cold, chlorinated water of my father's fountain. The laughter seemed to echo in the twilight, a cruel symphony of mockery that washed over me again and again. I was a spectacle, a drowned rat in a designer dress, the centerpiece of my father's twisted entertainment. I pushed my wet hair out of my eyes, my body trembling from a combination of cold and shock. I tried to stand, to pull myself out of the fountain with some semblance of dignity, but my limbs felt heavy, my spirit crushed. The faces in the crowd swam before my eyes, a blur of smug smiles and curious stares. I saw Florence, her phone still held high, a triumphant glint in her eyes. I saw my mother, hovering at the back of the crowd, her face a mask of horrified inaction. She was wringing her hands, her expression pained, but she did nothing. She said nothing. She was as much a prisoner of my father as I was. And then, a new sound cut through the noise. It was a voice, calm and clear and full of an authority that silenced the laughter in an instant. "That's enough." All heads turned toward the source of the voice. A man was walking toward the fountain, his stride purposeful and unwavering. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that spoke of quiet power and immense wealth. He moved with an easy confidence, an aura of command that seemed to part the sea of guests before him. He was handsome, with dark hair, sharp features, and intelligent eyes that were now fixed on me with an expression of fierce concern. He reached the edge of the fountain and, without a moment's hesitation, stepped over the marble lip and into the water. He didn't seem to notice or care that his expensive suit and polished leather shoes were being ruined. He reached me in 2 strides, his warm hands enclosing my cold, trembling ones. He pulled me to my feet, his grip strong and steady. "Are you all right, Diana?" he asked, his voice low and gentle, meant only for me. I could only nod, my throat tight with unshed tears. He wrapped his arm around my waist, holding me close, and then he turned to face the stunned crowd. My father was the first to find his voice. "Who the hell are you?" he blustered, his face red with a mixture of anger and confusion. "What do you think you're doing? This is a private party." The man's gaze shifted to my father, and his eyes, which had been so warm and gentle a moment before, turned to ice. "My name is Robert Sterling," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight. "And this is my wife." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The name Sterling was legendary in the city, in the country, in the world. Sterling Industries was a global behemoth, a pioneer in technology and innovation. The Sterling family was notoriously private, a dynasty of old money and quiet influence that dwarfed my father's new money empire into insignificance. And Robert Sterling, the current CEO, was a near-mythical figure, a brilliant and elusive billionaire who rarely made public appearances. To see him here at this wedding was shocking enough. To hear him claim me, the forgotten daughter, the family joke, as his wife, it was unthinkable. I saw the look on my father's face, a comical progression of disbelief, confusion, and then dawning horror. He stared at me, then at Robert, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Florence's smug smile had vanished, replaced by a look of utter shock. Her phone had dropped to her side, forgotten. My mother looked as though she was about to faint. "Your wife?" my father stammered, the words catching in his throat. "Yes," Robert said, his voice firm and unwavering. "My wife, and you just pushed her into a fountain." He let the words hang in the air, a quiet indictment that was more powerful than any shout. He began to lead me out of the fountain, his arm a protective shield around me. As we reached the edge, he shrugged off his suit jacket and wrapped it around my shoulders. It was warm and dry, a small comfort in the midst of the chaos. He then turned back to my father, his eyes narrowed and dangerous. "I think you owe my wife an apology," he said, his voice dangerously low. My father was speechless. He was a man who was used to being in control, a man who was used to being the most powerful person in any room. But in the presence of Robert Sterling, he was nothing. He was out of his depth, a small fish in a vast, unforgiving ocean. He looked around at his guests, at the people he had been so eager to impress, and saw only their shocked and judgmental faces. The laughter was gone, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. The joke was no longer on me. It was on him. Robert didn't wait for an apology that he knew would never come. He turned his back on my father, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and began to lead me away from the fountain, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. He walked me through the stunned guests, his head held high, his message clear. I was with him. I was protected. I was his. We walked past Florence, who looked at me with a new expression, a mixture of envy and disbelief. We walked past my mother, who reached out a trembling hand as if to stop me, but then let it fall back to her side. We walked through the grand marquee, past the string quartet that had fallen silent, and out into the cool night air. He didn't stop until we reached a sleek black car that was parked in the driveway, a car that was so expensive and understated that it made my father's flashy sports car look cheap and vulgar. A chauffeur was holding the door open, his face impassive. Robert helped me into the plush leather seat, then slid in beside me. He spoke a single word to the driver, "Home," and the car pulled away, leaving the Sinclair estate, the fairytale wedding, and the wreckage of my old life behind us. As the car sped down the long, tree-lined driveway, I looked back at the glowing marquee, at the place that had been the scene of my greatest humiliation. But I didn't feel the shame anymore. I didn't feel the pain. All I felt was the warmth of Robert's jacket around my shoulders, the steady presence of him beside me, and the first, faint glimmer of a future I had never dared to imagine. The ride home was silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows of the car, a stream of color in the darkness. I was still wrapped in Robert's jacket, the fine wool still holding the warmth of his body. The adrenaline of the past hour was beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I should have been relieved, triumphant, vindicated, but all I felt was a profound sense of emptiness. The grand, dramatic rescue had been a scene from a movie, a fairy tale ending to a nightmare evening. But now, in the quiet intimacy of the car, the reality of my situation began to sink in. Robert and I had been married for 6 months, a quiet ceremony at a city hall with 2 strangers as witnesses. It was a secret we had kept from everyone, especially my family. We had met a year earlier, at a rare books auction of all places. I was there for the Historical Society, hoping to acquire a collection of colonial-era letters. He was there for himself, a quiet collector with a passion for history that matched my own. We had struck up a conversation, a spark of connection that had quickly grown into a flame. With him, I wasn't the forgotten daughter or the disappointing archivist. I was just Diana, a woman he found intelligent and funny and beautiful. He was the first person who had ever truly seen me, and I had fallen for him harder and faster than I ever thought possible. He knew all about my family. I had told him everything, the years of neglect, the constant pressure, the feeling of never being good enough. He had listened with a quiet intensity, his anger on my behalf a soothing balm to my old wounds. He had wanted to meet them to tell them about us, but I had always resisted. I was afraid of what they would do, of how they would react. I was afraid they would try to co-opt him, to turn high. Into another one of their assets, another feather in the Sinclair cap. Or worse, I was afraid they would find a way to poison our relationship, to taint the one pure and good thing in my life. So we had kept our marriage a secret, a private world that belonged only to us. When we arrived at our apartment, a beautiful, spacious penthouse that still felt more like his home than ours, I went straight to the bedroom, stripping off my wet, ruined dress and taking a long, hot shower. I stood under the spray for what felt like an hour, trying to wash away the feeling of the fountain water, the feeling of their laughter, the feeling of my father's hand on my back. When I finally emerged, wrapped in a thick, fluffy towel, I found Robert waiting for me in the living room. He had changed into a simple sweater and jeans, and he was holding a glass of wine for me. He handed me the glass, his eyes searching my face. "How are you?" he asked, his voice soft. I took a sip of the wine, the rich, dark liquid a small comfort. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I feel empty." He sat down on the couch beside me, his presence a solid and reassuring weight. "I'm sorry, Diana," he said. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner. I'm sorry you had to go through that." I shook my head. "It's not your fault. It's theirs. It's always been them." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft hum of the city far below. Then he spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I never understood it," he said. "I never understood why they treated you that way. You're brilliant and kind and beautiful. You're everything they're not." I gave him a small, sad smile. "To them, I'm a liability. I'm the one who didn't follow the plan. I'm the one who chose a different path, and they can't stand it. They can't stand that I found happiness without them, without their money, without their approval." He took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. "Well," he said, his voice firm, "they're about to find out just how happy you are, and just how little you need them." My phone, which I had left on the coffee table, buzzed to life. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months, my mother. I ignored it. A moment later, it buzzed again. This time, it was Florence. Then came the text messages, a flood of them, one after another. They were a mixture of feigned concern, panicked questions, and thinly veiled demands for an explanation. "Who is he? Where did you meet him? Why didn't you tell us? You have no idea the trouble you've caused." Robert picked up my phone, his eyes scanning the messages with a look of growing disgust. He turned the phone off and placed it back on the table, face down. "You don't have to talk to them," he said. "Not until you're ready." He then pulled his own phone from his pocket, his fingers flying across the screen. "I, on the other hand," he said, a grim smile on his face, "have a few calls to make." I knew that look in his eyes. It was the look he got when he was about to close a major deal, the look of a man who was 10 steps ahead of everyone else. It was the look of a man who was about to go to war. And for the first time in my life, I knew I had a powerful ally in my corner, an army of one who would fight for me, who would protect me, who would help me finally break free from the gilded cage I had been born into. The whispers in the gilded halls of the Sinclair estate would soon turn into screams. The next morning, I woke up to a world that had irrevocably changed. The sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our apartment, but it felt different, brighter, as if a long-standing shadow had finally been lifted. Robert was already awake, sitting at the dining table with his laptop and a cup of coffee, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as I entered the room, and his serious expression softened into a warm smile. "Good morning, my love," he said. "Sleep well." I had, surprisingly. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I had slept without the familiar weight of anxiety pressing down on my chest. I felt light. "Better than I have in years," I admitted, pouring myself a cup of coffee. I glanced at his laptop screen and saw a series of complex spreadsheets and legal documents. "What are you doing?" I asked. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes gleaming with a strategic fire. "I'm making some inquiries," he said cryptically. "About your father's business." My father, James Sinclair, had built his empire on a foundation of aggressive real estate development and shrewd, often ruthless investments. He was a shark, a man who prided himself on his ability to smell blood in the water. He had many partners, many investors, many deals that were built on a complex web of financial and personal relationships. And as Robert began to quietly and discreetly pull on those threads, the web began to unravel with astonishing speed. The first call came from my mother. I had turned my phone back on that more. Ning, steeling myself for the inevitable onslaught. Her voice was frantic, a high-pitched whine of panic and accusation. "Diana, what have you done?" she shrieked, without so much as a hello. "Your father's partners are calling. They're pulling out of the deal for the new waterfront development. They said something about a conflict of interest. Do you have any idea how much money we stand to lose?" I listened calmly, my coffee cup warm in my hands. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Mother," I said, my voice cool and steady. It wasn't a lie. I didn't know the specifics of what Robert was doing, but I trusted him completely. The truth was, many of my father's biggest investors were also investors in Sterling Industries, or in one of the many smaller tech companies that Robert's firm had acquired over the years. They were men who had a deep and abiding respect for Robert Sterling, not just for his wealth, but for his integrity and his business acumen. A quiet word from him, a suggestion that James Sinclair was no longer a man to be trusted, was all it took. One by one, they began to distance themselves, to pull their money, to sever their ties. The waterfront deal, my father's crowning achievement, the project that was meant to cement his legacy, was collapsing like a house of cards. Next came the social fallout. Florence, my sister the influencer, suddenly found her world shrinking. The exclusive party invitations stopped arriving. The high-end brands that had been so eager to partner with her suddenly went silent, their PR teams no longer returning her calls. Her carefully curated circle of friends, the ones who had been so quick to laugh at my humiliation, were now avoiding her, their polite excuses barely concealing their fear of being associated with a family that had so publicly and so spectacularly offended Robert Sterling. Florence's currency was her social status, her proximity to power and influence. And overnight, that currency had been devalued to nothing. I received a tearful, hysterical call from her a few days after the wedding. "You've ruined me," she sobbed into the phone. "My life is over. I'm being canceled because of you. You have to talk to him, Diana. You have to tell him to call it off." I listened to her tirade, the same selfish, self-absorbed hysterics I had been hearing my entire life. But this time, I didn't feel the familiar urge to placate her, to soothe her, to make everything better. I felt nothing. "I'm sorry you're going through that, Florence," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "But these are the consequences of your own actions." And then I hung up. The final string to be cut was the most personal one. My parents, in a desperate attempt to control the narrative, had leaked a story to the press, a carefully crafted piece of fiction about their estranged and troubled daughter who had entrapped the unsuspecting billionaire. It was a vicious, pathetic attempt to paint me as a villain, a gold digger, a mentally unstable woman who had tricked her way into a world where she didn't belong. The article was filled with anonymous quotes from family friends who spoke of my rebellious nature and my long history of erratic behavior. It was a character assassination of the highest order, and it was the final straw. That evening, Robert and I sat down with his legal team and drafted a statement. It was simple, direct, and devastatingly effective. It corrected the lies, stated the simple truth of our relationship, and announced that I was formally and legally severing all ties with the Sinclair family. I was relinquishing my name, my inheritance, everything. The statement ended with a quiet but unmistakable threat. Any further attempts to slander or harass me or my husband would be met with the full force of the Sterling legal team. We released it to a single, highly respected news agency, and within an hour, it was everywhere. The golden strings that had bound me to my family, the strings of obligation, of fear, of a desperate and unrequited need for their love, had finally been cut. It was a terrifying and exhilarating feeling. I was adrift, but I was free. I was no longer Diana Sinclair, the forgotten daughter. I was just Diana. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed the release of my statement were a study in contrasts. For me, life became quiet and peaceful. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my life for as long as I could remember finally faded into silence. I went back to my job at the Historical Society, immersing myself in the familiar comfort of old books and faded documents. My colleagues, who had read the news with a mixture of shock and delight, treated me with a new level of respect and a fierce, protective loyalty. They had always known me as Diana, the quiet, dedicated archivist. The revelation that I was married to Robert Sterling didn't change their perception of me, but it did change their perception of the family I had escaped. For the Sinclairs, however, the silence was of a different kind. It was the silence of a sinking ship, the silence of a world collapsing in on itself. The financial bleeding that had begun with the waterfront deal had turned into a full-blown hemorrhage. My father, in his arrogance, had over-leveraged his company, borrowing heavily against the projected success of his new development. When his investors pulled out, he was left with a mountain of debt and no way to pay it. He tried to secure new funding, to call in old favors, but the doors that had once been so readily open to him were now slammed shut in his face. No one wanted to do business with a man who had earned the quiet wrath of Robert Sterling. The whispers in the gilded halls of the city's elite had turned into a roar of condemnation. The story of what had happened at the wedding had spread like wildfire, the details becoming more and more embellished with each telling. But the core of the story remained the same. James Sinclair, in a fit of drunken cruelty, had publicly humiliated his own daughter, only to discover that she was married to one of the most powerful men in the country. It was a story of hubris and comeuppance, a modern-day morality play that had the city captivated. My father, who had spent his entire life cultivating an image of power and success, had become a laughingstock, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties and in corporate boardrooms. The first tangible sign of the collapse came when the for sale sign went up in front of the Sinclair estate. The sprawling mansion, the scene of so many of my childhood miseries and my ultimate humiliation, was being sold to pay off a fraction of my father's debts. My mother was devastated. The house was her kingdom, the symbol of her status, the stage upon which she had performed the role of the perfect society hostess for 30 years. To lose it was to lose her identity. Florence's fall from grace was just as swift and just as brutal. Her social media presence, once a glittering stream of sponsored posts and exotic vacations, had become a toxic wasteland. Her comment sections were flooded with messages of disgust and condemnation. She was no longer an influencer, she was a pariah. Her fiancé, the man from the equally prominent family, quietly and unceremoniously called off the engagement, his family eager to distance themselves from the Sinclair scandal. Florence, who had never worked a day in her life, who had no skills beyond posing for pictures and spending her father's money, was left with nothing. I watched all of this from a distance, a detached observer of the slow and steady demolition of the House of Sinclair. I felt no joy, no triumph, no satisfaction in their downfall. All I felt was a quiet sense of closure, the feeling of a long and painful chapter of my life finally coming to an end. Robert, who had been my shield and my sword through it all, never once said, "I told you so." He simply held my hand, his steady presence a constant source of strength and comfort. The final blow came in the form of a small, discreet article in the business section of the newspaper. Sinclair Holdings had filed for bankruptcy. The empire that my father had built, the empire, for which he had sacrificed his family, his integrity, and his soul, was gone. It had all crumbled to dust, blown away by the winds of change that had been set in motion by a single, cruel act on a warm summer evening. The House of Sinclair, once a towering monument to wealth and power, was nothing more than a ruin, a testament to the fact that money can build a kingdom, but it cannot buy a soul. One evening, a few months after the bankruptcy was announced, I received a letter. It was from my mother. Her familiar, elegant handwriting was shaky, the words stained with what looked like tears. It was a long, rambling letter, a stream of consciousness torrent of regret and self-pity. She wrote of her shame, her sorrow, her loneliness. She wrote that she had been a coward, that she had been so blinded by her fear of my father that she had forgotten how to be a mother. She begged for my forgiveness, for a chance to see me, to talk to me, to try and rebuild what had been broken. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it away in a drawer. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, if I could ever truly let her back into my life. The wounds were too deep, the scars too old. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than anger or indifference toward her. It was a faint, fragile ember of pity. She was a victim of my father's cruelty as much as I was, a different kind of victim, but a victim nonetheless. The fall of the House of Sinclair had set me free, but it had left her, and my sister and my father, trapped in the ruins. A year passed. The seasons changed, the city moved on, and the Sinclair scandal faded from the headlines, replaced by new dramas, new triumphs, new failures. For the world, it was old news. But for me, it was the beginning of a new life, a life that was finally and truly my own. The quiet, peaceful existence I had craved for so long was now my reality. Robert and I settled into a comfortable rhythm, a life filled with shared passions and quiet joys. We spent our weekends exploring dusty antique shops and obscure historical sites, our evenings curled up on the couch with old books and new ideas. He was more than my husband. He was my partner, my best friend, my anchor in a world that had once felt so stormy. We decided to do something with the money that would have been my inheritance, the money that I had so publicly renounced. Robert's lawyers had managed to secure the trust fund that my grandparents had set up for me years ago, a fund that my father had no legal right to touch. It wasn't a vast fortune, but it was significant, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. We established the Sterling Foundation for Historical Preservation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding under-resourced archives, museums, and historical societies across the country. Our first project was to save a small, struggling local museum that was on the verge of closing its doors, a place that reminded me so much of my own beloved workplace. The work was fulfilling in a way I had never imagined. It was a way to turn the ugliness of my past into something beautiful and lasting. It was a way to build a new legacy, one that had nothing to do with stock prices or social status, and everything to do with preserving the stories of the past for the generations of the future. The Sterling name, once a symbol of corporate power, was now also a symbol of something more, something quieter, something that felt more like me. I never saw my father again. After the bankruptcy, he had disappeared from public life, a disgraced and broken man. I heard through the grapevine that he and my mother had divorced, that he was living a solitary life in a small, rented condo, a ghost of the titan he had once been. I sometimes wondered if he ever felt any remorse, if he ever understood the true cost of his cruelty. But I knew that it didn't matter. His presence, or lack thereof, no longer had any power over me. My mother continued to write to me, long, pleading letters filled with a desperate loneliness. I never wrote back, but I never threw them away either. They were a reminder of a life I had left behind, a testament to the long and difficult road I had traveled. Perhaps one day, years from now, I would be ready to see her again. But not yet. The wounds were still healing, the scars still tender. As for Florence, her story was perhaps the most surprising of all. After hitting rock bottom, with no money, no fiancé, and no friends, she had been forced to do something she had never done before: get a job. She started as a sales assistant in a high-end boutique, a humbling experience for a woman who had once been their best customer. But to everyone's astonishment, she thrived. She discovered a talent for fashion, a genuine passion for helping women feel beautiful and confident. She went back to school, got a degree in design, and eventually started her own small, independent clothing line. Her brand was built on a foundation of authenticity and hard work, a world away from the superficial glamour of her influencer days. She reached out to me once, a short, hesitant email with a simple subject line: "I'm sorry." She didn't make excuses, she didn't ask for forgiveness. She just told me her story, what she had learned, and how she had changed. And she ended the email with a single sentence: "You were always the strong one, Diana. I just wish I had seen it sooner." I replied with 3 simple words: "I wish you well." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was a recognition that people can change, that even the most broken of relationships can, with time and effort, begin to heal. One sunny afternoon, Robert and I were at the grand reopening of the local museum that our foundation had saved. The place was bustling with energy, filled with schoolchildren and families, their faces bright with curiosity and wonder. I stood in a quiet corner, watching a little girl press her face against a glass case, her eyes wide with awe at a collection of centuries-old pottery. Robert came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. "Look at what you've built, Diana," he whispered in my ear. I smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached all the way to my soul. He was right. This was what I had built. Not a corporate empire, not a social media following, but something real, something that mattered. I had taken the pain of my past and transformed it into a future that was filled with purpose and light. The girl who had been pushed into the fountain was gone, washed away in a flood of shame and humiliation. But the woman who had emerged from the water was stronger, freer, and happier than she had ever dreamed she could be. I was no longer a Sinclair, and I was more than a Sterling. I was just Diana, and my story was just beginning.